Cool. All right. So also all of the test correction have been graded. So if you can, you should check out your test correction and just go see if you did it right. And hopefully you didn't do anything wrong. But let's get started. So let me share my notes for chapter 10. Oh. Um, Let me take away this chime. There we go. All right. So today we're gonna get started with 10.1. So 10.1, you get the language of hypothesis testing. And it's kind of important that you do kind of understand the language because essentially from chapter 10 all the way to chapter 14, all we're going to be doing, hypothesis testing. The only thing different is essentially we're going to be changing up the parameter, or we're going to be changing up how many population are we sampling from. So if you're able to get 10.1, that's a good start because 10.1 will be essential for the rest of the chapter that we go on to do. All right, so pretty much 10.1 is the start of hypothesis testing. So you kind of just want to know, like, what is a hypothesis? So a hypothesis is essentially an idea that a researcher want to test out. So they don't know if their hypothesis is correct or not correct, but this is the process they want to go through in order to test to see if their hypothesis is correct. So usually for a hypothesis, there's two different type of hypothesis. And let's go down here. So the two different type of hypothesis that we're kind of going to be focusing on is the null hypothesis, and the label for the null hypothesis is HO. We're also going to have the alternate hypothesis, and the alternate hypothesis is H1. So kind of think about the null hypothesis. This is the default position. So that's the default position. So pretty much the null hypothesis just saying whatever we thought was true is still true. So that's what the null hypothesis is stating. So kind of think about it like if I'm trying to disprove that the sky is blue, the null hypothesis will be that yes, the sky is still blue. The alternate hypothesis will essentially be what I'm trying to prove. And use the alternate hypothesis is the researcher claim. Because the alternate hypothesis is what we're trying to prove is correct or not correct. And we're really not trying to prove the null hypothesis is correct, because since the null hypothesis is already the default position, we're essentially already assuming the null hypothesis is correct. We want to see if there's enough evidence to prove that the alternate hypothesis is correct. And the label for the alternate hypothesis in this book is H1. So you do kind of want to know the symbol between null hypothesis and alternate hypothesis, because you are going to have to write many hypotheses for this chapter and pretty much for the rest of the chapters. All right, everybody good on hypothesis or the null hypothesis and the alternate hypothesis? All right, sweet. Let's scroll on down. All right, so let's go to page 2. All right, so pretty much I'm going to give you like an outline of pretty much this entire chapter. So for this entire chapter, we're going to be dealing with two different null and alternate hypotheses. So there could be 3 different setups for the null and alternate hypothesis. So here's one of them. Didn't do what I wanted to do. All right, so we're gonna have three different set of null and alternate hypotheses. Because if you look at the null hypothesis for each one of these, one that I highlighted in yellow, red, and blue, if you look at all of them, it says a parameter is equal to some value. So let's define what is a parameter. So a parameter could be any of these three values. So kind of going back to chapter 9, where in chapter 9, we did a confidence interval for three different parameters. We did it for P, we did it for mu, and we did it for sigma. So same thing for chapter 10, we're gonna be doing a hypothesis test where we're gonna be testing out the parameter of P, the parameter of mu, and parameter of sigma. So where it says parameter, this is where you're gonna either put mu, P, or sigma. Cool. So whatever it says parameter, you're gonna input either P, mu, or sigma. And then if you look at where it says some value, that's where you're gonna put the value that you think is equal to. So say if I'm flipping a coin and I believe the coin is fair, you will say, hey, P is equal to 0.50. So where it says parameter, you're gonna input either P, mu, or sigma, depending on which parameter we're testing out. And where it says some value, pretty much the value is pretty much the value that we think that that parameter is equal to. Cool. Everybody good with go in parameter and what's go in some value? Cool. All right, so if you notice for the null hypothesis, they're all stating the same thing. Parameter is equal to some value because it's essentially stating the default position. Because the default position is we're going to say the parameter is actually equal to that number that they're saying. The alternate hypothesis, that's where we're trying to prove that that's not true. So we can have three different types of alternate hypotheses. We can either have, oops, sorry about that. We can either have it where it says not equal to. We can have it where it says less than. Or we can have it where it says greater than. So depending on what the researcher is trying to prove, you will use one of those three inequality. So if we're trying to prove that the parameter is wrong, we usually want to use not equal to. If we want to prove that it's less than that number, we say less than. Or if we want to prove that it's actually greater than that number, it will be that. Well, for the alternate hypothesis, no, because if you look at the null hypothesis, that's where you put the equal. So the null hypothesis where you will put is equal, but for the alternate hypothesis, we're usually trying to prove that it's not that number. All right. Any question or any other questions? Cool. All right, so what we're gonna go ahead and do, we're gonna go ahead and practice on creating a null and alternate hypothesis. So first thing you're gonna say, what is the parameter? And then we'll put HO and we'll do H1. All right, so let's do these three. So it said in 2008, 62% of American adults regularly volunteered their time for charity work. A researcher believes that that percentage is different today. So if you had a guess, which parameter do you think we're doing? So do you think it's P? Do you think it's mu? Or do you think it's sigma? Cool. So you put P and P. So if you know for the null hypothesis, you can pretty much just put the equal sign because the equal sign should go there. So we're gonna say P is equal to the last known percentage. So they told us that 62% of American adults regularly volunteer. So we're gonna go like, we still believe that that number is accurate. So we're gonna say P is equal to 0.62. And you also put that number down here. Your alternate hypothesis, you pretty much put what your researcher is trying to prove. So if you look at it, it says a researcher believes that the percentage is different today. So if it's different today, which one should I put? Not equal to, less than, or should I put greater than? Not equal to. And also just for the future, whenever it's not equal to, they call this a two-tailed test. All right, but that's it for A. So you know is P because if you look at the data set they're giving me, it's proportional data set or percentages. That's how I know it's P. All right, let's go on to B. So for B, it says the Turtle Pizza Shop normally take an average of 48 minutes to deliver a pizza. Rafael, the owner, implemented a new system for delivering pizza that he believed will reduce the time required to get a pizza to his customer. So for this one, if you had a guess, which parameter do you think we're testing? P, mu, or sigma? Cool. Sigma. Well, not sigma. All right. And if you look right here, the keyword that they kind of tell us, they say average. All right. So they say normally the delivery is on average 48 minutes. So you want to put 48 minutes here. All right. But if you look at Rafael, he implemented this new system. So with implementing this new system, what does he think will happen to that time? Do you think it will go higher or do you think it will go lower? Lower. Perfect. All right, and that's it for B. Any question for B? All right, let's do the final one. So it said using an old manufacturing process, the standard deviation of the amount of wine put in a bottle was 0.23 ounces. With new equipment, the quality control manager believes the standard deviation has decreased. All right, so for this one, which parameter are we testing? Forgot to put that here. Ooh, sigma. There you go, sigma, sigma, equal. All right, so what was the last known standard deviation that they gave us? Yeah, 0.23. There you go, 0.23, 0.23. Cool. And what do they think will happen now that they're implementing this new equipment? Do you think the standard deviation should go up, down, or just be different? Yeah, down. Cool. All right. So this is called a one-tail test. And more explicitly, it's called a left tail test. Left tail test. The same thing could be said about the last problem that we did. So anytime you either have less than or if it says greater than, that's technically called a one-tail test because you're essentially just covering one tail. Because you're either going to cover the left side of the tail or the right side of the tail. If it's a two-tail test, sorry, essentially you have two tail because it could either be the left tail or the right tail. All right, but that's it for C. Everybody good for C? So for these problems, it is going to take a lot of being able to just read the problem and be able to like figure out what's given to me and what do they want us to pretty much find out. So you do have to be careful with reading these problems because if you're not looking for the right thing, like you will get the wrong answer. So just make sure when you're reading it, see what are they testing And that's going to tell you which parameter they're doing, because they're testing the standard deviation, you know, sigma. If they're testing the average or the mean, you know, it's mu. Or if they're testing a proportion of a data set, you know, it should be p. All right, but that's it for the non-alternating hypothesis. All right. So up next, we're getting to something called error. Because anytime you're doing a hypothesis test, well, you're never, ever gonna always get the correct answer, or you're never gonna come up with the correct result. Because there's gonna be some time where you conclude that your hypothesis is correct, but in actuality, that hypothesis is actually incorrect. Or vice versa, you could say your hypothesis was incorrect, but it actually is correct. So there's actually different symbol or different way to call those type of error, because essentially what we're gonna go over now is the chances of you making an error. So of you coming up with the wrong conclusion. So for that one, we have something called a type 1 error. Oops. Type 1 error. And we have a type 2 error. And that's alpha and that's beta. So if we have alpha, that's a type 1 error. If we have beta, which is the B, that's a type 2 error. So if you look at the type 2 error, or sorry, type 1 error, it says rejecting the null hypothesis when the null hypothesis is true. So what that's meaning is saying that we conclude the alternative hypothesis is correct when the null hypothesis was actually correct. So kind of going back to the example that I gave you about the sky is blue. So a type 1 error would be me saying the sky is, say, red, but in actuality, the sky is actually blue. So that's a type 1 error. We conclude the researcher claim, but the default or the null hypothesis was always true. All right. Any question for a type 1 error? All right, let's do a type 2 error. A type 2 error is when you pretty much say the null hypothesis is correct when the alternative hypothesis is actually correct. So in this case scenario, it will be me stating that the sky is blue, but in actuality, the sky is actually red. So that will be a type 2 error. We conclude the default null hypothesis, but it was actually the researcher claim that was correct. All right. Everybody kind of get with the basic idea of what's a type 1 and type 2 error is? Like we're gonna go over some more examples right now. Like a lot of examples right now. All right. All right, so to kind of get you started, we're gonna do this. So let's do this table right here. All right, so if you look at the top, and if you're looking at these columns, so kind of just assume that this is the actual truth. So it says given the null hypothesis is either true or given the null hypothesis is false. So you kind of think about this like we actually know whether the null hypothesis is true or the null hypothesis is false. So when it says the null hypothesis is true, that means like we know that the null hypothesis should have been chosen. Or if it said null hypothesis is false, that means that we know that the null hypothesis shouldn't have been chosen. And then what we have right here we have your decision based on a random sample. So this isn't us knowing if we came up with the right or wrong decision. This is us concluding something based off of our sample. So we're either going to say we reject the null hypothesis. When we say reject the null hypothesis, we're saying the null hypothesis is not true and the alternative hypothesis is actually true. And when we say do not reject the null hypothesis, do not reject the null hypothesis just means the null hypothesis is true. So here we'll say H1, true. We'll say HO, All right, so let's do a simple one right now. So say we're gonna do this box right here. All right, so if you look at that box, if you look at where does it land on the row and where does it land on the column, it's saying that based off of our sample, we do not reject the null hypothesis. And if you look at the column, it's saying the null hypothesis is true. So if we didn't reject the null hypothesis and the null hypothesis is true, we came up with the right decision because that was the right decision to do. It was right for me to say we do not reject the null hypothesis because the null hypothesis actually turned out to be true. Here's another case scenario. So right here, we reject the null hypothesis. So we're saying the null hypothesis is wrong and we're saying the alternate hypothesis is correct. And if you look at this column on top here, it's saying HO is false and the alternate hypothesis is true. So if I reject the null hypothesis and the null hypothesis is not true, then that's the right decision. So in both of those scenarios, we did the correct decision. Now let's do a wrong decision. So if you look at it, I highlighted two of them. So let's move and let's do this one. So let's see why is that a wrong decision. So if you look at it based on the sample, we rejected the null hypothesis. But if you look at it, the null hypothesis was actually true. So that's why this is an error, because we said the null hypothesis was incorrect, but it actually turned out the null hypothesis was true. So in this case scenario, we're describing that we came up with the wrong decision. But if you look at our alpha, we have alpha right there because it's saying this is a type 1 error. Anytime we reject the null hypothesis, when the null hypothesis is true, that's a type 1 error. Now let's look at the next box over here. So if you look at that one, the reason why this is a wrong decision, because if you look at the decision we came up based off our random sample, we did not reject the null hypothesis. So we said the null hypothesis was true. But if you look at this part right here, it actually turned out that the alternate hypothesis was true. So we're saying the null hypothesis is true based off of our sample, but in actuality, the alternate hypothesis was actually correct. So that's why this is a wrong decision, and this will be a type 2 error. So that's kind of a breakdown of all of the decision or all of the pretty much conclusion you could come up with based off if the null hypothesis is true or the alternate hypothesis is true. Any question in regard to that? All right, sweet. So let's practice on this next problem. So for this next problem, what we're gonna use a justice system. So for the justice system, we're gonna say HO is not guilty. We're gonna say H1 is guilty. So right here we have jury decision based on the evidence. And then on top right here, we're gonna have the defendant is not guilty or the defendant is guilty. So kind of think about it, at the end of the trial, the defendant will actually tell us like, yes, I was guilty or yes, I wasn't guilty. So hypothetically, if they tell us at the end whether they were actually guilty or actually not guilty. So for this one, why do you think the null hypothesis is not guilty? Like, why is that the default position? Well, what do they say? Cool. So you're innocent till proven guilty. So that means the default position is you're innocent and they have to have evidence in order to prove you're guilty. So that way the null hypothesis is pretty much not guilty and the alternate hypothesis is guilty. Because in order for me to prove that you're guilty, you need some sort of evidence. Like you can't just go out and just say you're guilty without evidence. You have to have the evidence in order to pretty much disprove the null hypothesis and prove that the alternate hypothesis is correct. Good. All right, so let's go ahead and let's look at these boxes. So let's look at this box over here, or let's say cell. So the jury, so let's say the jury said the person was not guilty and the defendant actually turned out to be not guilty. Is that the right decision or is that a wrong decision? Cool, thanks. So say right. All right, let's do this next box over here. So if the jury said, based off of their evidence, said the person was not guilty, but the defendant is actually guilty, like, is that the right decision or is that wrong? Cool. All right, 2 for 2. Let's do this next one. All right, so if the jury said, based off of the evidence, we said this person was guilty, but the person actually turned out to be not guilty, is that the right decision or is that a wrong decision? Cool, so we got wrong. All right, so the last one. So the last one said the jury decision based on the evidence is the person is guilty, but the defendant is actually guilty. Is that right or is that the wrong decision? Cool. So let's go right. All right. So now what we're gonna do, we're gonna assign what type of wrong is it. So when I say we're gonna assign what type of wrong, that means we're either gonna do a type 1 error or we're gonna say the type 2 error. So if I put alpha, that's type 1 error. If I do beta, that's a type 2 error. So for this one, all you have to do, you just look at it. So either this one or this one, it's gonna be either a type 1 error or a type 2 error. So the way that we figure out which one is a type 1 error, pretty much all you have to do is look at which one did they reject the null hypothesis. Did we reject the null hypothesis for wrong number 1? Or did we reject the null hypothesis for wrong number 2? Well, did I reject it on wrong number 2? Because if you look at wrong number 2, the jury said the person was not guilty. So wouldn't that be the null hypothesis? So we're saying the null hypothesis was true. So for this one, that will be your type 1 error. So the type 1 error will be that you say a person is guilty when in actuality they're innocent. So that's the case where you send an innocent person to jail. So that means this one has to be a type 2 error because a type 2 error will be you pretty much send a guilty person and let them free. All right, so that's your type 1 and type 2 error. So whenever you're doing a type 1 and type 2 error, always think about it as if which one did I reject the null hypothesis, whichever one you rejected the null hypothesis, that's your type 1 error. Whichever one you didn't reject the null hypothesis, that's gonna be your type 2 error. Everybody kind of go with this? All right. So up next, we're gonna go over where it says remark. So remark said the probability of making a type 1 error alpha is chosen by the research before the sample data is collected. And then if you look right below that, it says the level of significant alpha is the probability of making a type 1 error. So whenever you see either level of significant alpha or type 1 error, you just know all three of them are the same thing. So they're all three talking about the same thing, and you're talking about the probability of you making an error. So the last thing before we move on to the next page is this one. So note as the probability of making a type 1 error increases, the probability of making a type 2 error decreases, and vice versa. Cool. All right, so let's go back to the justice system problem. Which error do you think is the more grievous error? The error of sending an innocent person to jail, or the error of sending a guilty person and letting them free? Like, which one do you think is worse? Well, we have to choose one. If you had to choose one, all right, so we'll do innocent to jail. All right, so we'll say innocent to jail. So the first one. All right, so if I'm super paranoid about making that type of error, what am I gonna need? Like if I'm a juror in this in the case, like what do I need? All right, so I need evidence. But am I gonna be okay with like a little evidence or medium evidence, or am I gonna want like a lot of evidence in order to send this person to jail? So you're gonna want a lot. So let's say this represents how much evidence do you want? So you want a lot of evidence. So like in order for me to prove that this person did it, like you want like fingerprints, you want videotape, you want eyewitnesses putting them person there, and so you want everything for that way you can kind of be assured that this person is guilty. But do you think you're always gonna get that? Like you're not always gonna get that. So if my proof to if my amount of evidence that I need in order to prove that somebody is actually guilty is so high, what's gonna happen? Like what's gonna happen? You're gonna let more person who are actually guilty, and you're gonna let them free, because in order for you to prove that anybody is guilty of anything, you're gonna need so much evidence that sometimes it's going to be kind of impossible to give you all the evidence you need in order to prove that somebody is guilty. So if you need so much evidence, well, the chances of you doing a type 1 error go down, but the chances of you making a type 2 error now goes up, because now you're sending more people who are guilty and letting them free because you're afraid to send one person, well, one innocent person to jail. And also work vice versa. If you're like super paranoid and you don't want to let any guilty person free, like if you want to lower that probability, that just means you're gonna send more people to jail that are actually innocent. Because if you think the person is guilty, essentially you're gonna send them to jail. So you're gonna need less evidence. As long as they give you like a dirty look, you're gonna send them to jail, because you're gonna go like, well, obviously this person did it, so you're not gonna need that much evidence. So you kind of know, like for type 1 and type 2 error, they kind of work off of each other. If you lower the chances of making a type 1 error, then you're actually just making it easier to make a type 2 error, or vice versa. Everybody good for type 1 and type 2 error? All right, well, I guess no. So let's do some more for type 1 and type 2 error. So let's do this next problem. All right. So for this one's an example of type 1, type 2 error. Describe a type 1 error and a type 2 error for the following null and alternate hypothesis. All right, so the null hypothesis is a person is not pregnant. The alternate hypothesis is a person is pregnant. So once again, why do you think the null hypothesis is a person is not pregnant? Cool, yeah. So there's a higher chance that somebody is not pregnant. Like, in order for us to say a person is pregnant, like, what do you usually need? All right, yeah, you will want to test to kind of see if they're pregnant. But what other evidence can we use to kind of determine if somebody might be pregnant? Cool, yeah. So we could see a big belly, or yeah, we could use the ultrasound, throw up. Yeah. But yeah, so you kind of want to see evidence. So you kind of want to see evidence. You kind of say somebody is pregnant because you don't want to go to some random person and just start rubbing their belly and saying, "Hey, are you pregnant?" Like you kind of want to have evidence in order to kind of show that that person is pregnant. So what we're gonna go ahead and do, we're gonna do a type 1 error and we're gonna do a type 2 error. So we're gonna do alpha and we're gonna do a beta. Cool. So in a type 1 error, what conclusion does the person make? So in a type 1 error, do we conclude they're pregnant or do we conclude that they're not pregnant? Cool. So type 1 error, we say a person. But they are not pregnant. Wait. All right. So the type 1 error, a type 1 error will be we say a person is pregnant, but they are not pregnant. So that's your type 1 error. So in a type 2 error, what conclusion do we make at first? Not pregnant. There we go. All right. So we say a person is not pregnant, but they are. All right, cool. So in a type 2 error, we say a person is not pregnant. So we accept the null hypothesis, but they are not pregnant. But they are pregnant. So if you notice both of them, they're explaining that we came up with a wrong conclusion because it's saying like, okay, we concluded this, but it should have been this other thing. So you kind of know type 1 and type 2 error is describing pretty much an error that we made. All right, well, that's it for that example. Any question for that example? Yeah. All right, let's go to the next example. So coronary art, a group of coronary art student is comparing two methods for preparing asparagus, traditional steaming and a new frying method. They want to know if patrons of their school restaurant prefer the new frying method over the traditional steaming method. A sample of patrons are given asparagus prepared using each method and asked to select their preference. A statistical analysis is performed to determine if more than 50% of a participant prefer the new frying method. So if you look right here, this is for prefer new frying method. So if you look at it, it says P is equal to 0.50, because you're saying like, okay, not the majority, because essentially what we want the majority of the people to prefer the new frying method. So when it says P is equal to 0.50, that is mean the majority of the patrons don't prefer the new frying method. If you look at the alternative hypothesis, if you look at it, said P is greater than 0.50, that means more than 50% or more than 50% of the patron actually prefer the new frying method. So we are just looking for the majority. So it doesn't matter if it's like 51%. As long as it's more than 50%, we're gonna say they prefer the new frying method. So let's do a type 1 and a type 2 error. So for this one, I might need a little bit more room. So for a type 1 error, what do I conclude? Do I conclude that they don't prefer the new frying method, or do I conclude they do prefer the new frying method? Oh, they do, perfect. So we'll say the patron prefer So in the type 1 error, we'll say the patron prefer the new frying method, but they really don't. And that's your type 1 error. So the type 1 error would be like, hey, like we say the patron actually do prefer this new frying method that we're doing, but actually it turned out that it wasn't true. They actually don't prefer the new frying method, and we got this new method and pretty much we're wasting it. So that's a type 1 error. So let's do a type 2 error. So a type 2 error, what would it be? So will we conclude the patron prefer the new frying method, or that they don't prefer the new frying method? So say the patron don't. So that would be our type 2 error. It would be the patron don't prefer the new frying method, but they really do. And that's it for the second problem for type 1 and type 2 error. Any question for the type 1, type 2 error for this last problem? All right. So let's do these next two. So it says, suppose we conduct a hypothesis test on the average height of men and reject the null hypothesis that HO of mu is equal to 66 inches. If the true average height of the population of men is 69, what can be said about our decision to reject the null hypothesis? All right, so kind of think about it like we're trying to see if the average height of men still stand from like 10 years ago, it is still valid for today. So we're going to say 10 years ago, it was 66. And then in 2020, we actually found out that the average height of men is 69. So were they correct to reject the null hypothesis that mu is equal to 66? Or did it create an error? Cool, thanks. So for this one, they came up with the right decision because if they reject the fact that the mean height of man is 66 inches, and it actually turned out that it was 69 inches. If you look at it, 66 is different from 69. So it was valid for them to reject the null hypothesis. All right, so let's do this last one. Well, you're gonna do this one. I'll do a poll. So this one says, suppose we conduct a hypothesis test on the average salary of a single mother and reject the null hypothesis that mu is equal to $45,000. If the true average salary of a single mother is $45,000, what can be said about our conclusion for our hypothesis test? So A, we made the right decision. B, we made a type 1 error. C, we made a type 2 error, or D, none of the above. All right, cool. So we got almost 100% participation. All right, so that's what you put. So we got 2 people who said we made the correct decision. We had 8 people who said no, we actually came up with the wrong decision, and the wrong decision that we came up with was a type 1 error. And lastly, we came up with C, which is C, we made a type 2 error. So let's stop sharing this and let's go over it. So if you look at it, pretty much they said that the mean salary for a single mother was 45,000, and it actually turned out that it was 45,000. So if they would have said the null hypothesis was correct, or they would have failed to reject the null hypothesis, this would have been the correct decision. But if you look at it, it said they rejected the null hypothesis, so we automatically know it's not A. So it should be B or C because they rejected the null hypothesis, and actually the null hypothesis was correct. So they made a grave error. So now we have to figure out which type of error did they make. Did they make a type 1 error or a type 2 error? And all you have to do to figure out if they make a type 1 or type 2 error, type 1 error, they will say they rejected HO. In a type 2 error, they will say fail to reject HO. And if you look at this problem, they say they rejected the null hypothesis. So that one should be B. All right, and that's it for that last problem. Any question for that last problem? All right, so let's go down to the last page and then we're done. Dun. All right, so for this last page, it is going to talk about how we should do a conclusion. So for the conclusion, the thing is, you kind of have to think about the null hypothesis. So the null hypothesis is essentially already proven to be true because we already proved the null hypothesis was correct some time before. So we never really care if the null hypothesis is true. We only care if we could disprove the null hypothesis. So kind of think about it like if you go ahead and you do a study to prove that the sky is actually not blue, but then you actually find out, hey, the sky is actually blue. If you go out and run out and tell somebody, hey, the sky is blue, are they really gonna care that you found out that the sky is blue? Like, no, because he already knew the sky was blue. So whenever we make a conclusion, we always want to make the conclusion about the alternative hypothesis. So we either want to say, hey, there's not enough evidence to prove the alternative hypothesis, or we want to prove there is enough evidence to prove the alternative hypothesis. And also kind of think about it like in the court system. In the court system, like, do they ever tell the defendant they're innocent? Well, yeah. So if you look at it, they always say not guilty. So they don't say, hey, this person is innocent. They're saying based off of the evidence, we don't have enough evidence to prove that you're actually guilty. So they never really say you're innocent. They say based off of this evidence that we had against you right now, we really couldn't prove that you were actually guilty. So for this, for these conclusions, you never want to say the null hypothesis is true. You always want to say either if we have enough evidence for the alternate hypothesis, or if we don't have enough evidence. All right, so let's go ahead and do this one. So let me go ahead and do the null and alternate hypothesis just in case you forgot about this one. All right. So for this one, the Raphael owner, I remember he implemented the new system to see if he could lower the delivery time. So the null hypothesis is no, the new system doesn't really work. The delivery time is still going to be 48 minutes. The alternate hypothesis is saying, yes, the delivery system does work, and it's gonna be less than 48 minutes. So for this one, part A, it says, suppose the sample evidence indicate the null hypothesis should be rejected. So right here it says reject HO. So if it says reject HO, that means pretty much we know the null hypothesis is not true because we're rejecting that and you're concluding the alternate hypothesis. So anytime you come up with a conclusion to say reject the null hypothesis, that's what you're doing. You're saying the null hypothesis is not true and we should conclude the alternate hypothesis is true. So the way that we'll write the conclusion, we'll say, and kind of also think about it like court system, we'll say there is enough, or here, let's say that there is strong evidence to support the alternate hypothesis and then what you want to do is state what the alternate hypothesis is saying. So right here we'll say there is strong evidence to support the alternate hypothesis that the new, what was this? So for this one, we'll put there is strong evidence to support the alternate hypothesis that the new system for delivering pizza reduced the time required. And that's it. So if you look at it where you're saying, is there strong evidence or is there no evidence to support this? So since we reject the null hypothesis, we're rejecting the fact that the new system, it didn't make a difference, and we're concluding that the new system is actually helping reduce the pizza. So that's how you want to do it if we reject the null hypothesis. All right. Any question for A? All right, so let's do B. So for B, if you look at it, say, suppose the sample evidence indicate the null hypothesis should not be rejected. State the wording of the conclusion. So whenever they say should not be rejected, we're going to be using fail to reject HO. So if it says should not be rejected, that means we fail to reject HO. So when we fail to reject HO, that means we accept HO. But you never ever want to say accept HO. So because HO, we can already prove that the average delivery time for the pizza was 48 minutes. So we really don't care if the null hypothesis is still true because we kind of wanted to prove that this new system will help reduce. So since we failed to reject the null hypothesis, your conclusion will pretty much look the same. The only thing you'll change, instead of putting strong, you put weak. Because since we weren't able to reject the null hypothesis, that means the evidence we have wasn't strong enough. So where you say there is weak evidence to support the alternate hypothesis that the new system for delivering pizza reduced the time required. And that's how you want to do it when you put reject the null hypothesis. Oh, actually, don't want to do that. So when we reject the null hypothesis, you want to state there is strong evidence to support, and then just put your alternative hypothesis. If you fail to reject the null hypothesis, you want to state there is weak evidence to support the alternative hypothesis, and then you just put whatever your alternative hypothesis is. But whenever you're doing these conclusions, you should never, ever, ever mention the null hypothesis. You're always going to be stating a statement about the alternative hypothesis. All right, but that's it for that problem. Any question for that last problem? Oh, I think that should be it. All right, cool. So we're gonna stop right here because I really don't want to go into the math of it because I don't want to confuse you for your test. So just remember, for most of you, you're gonna have your test on Monday. So I'll set up the homework bank for that way for test number 3, you could turn in the homework for chapter 7, 8, and 9. And I'll also just get the test correction started for that way. Like if you already want to do the test correction, you could get started with the test correction. All right, but any question before I close out this meeting? For 9.4, you can actually do 9.4. 9.4 is a review of 9.3, 9.2, and 9.1. Because 9.4 is essentially going to give you problem for each one of those sections. So if you kind of want to practice on that, you could practice on that because it is giving you a different question from those different chapters. So it's kind of like a good way to kind of be able to distinguish which one, like to distinguish a different type of confidence interval. But yeah, you could do 9.4. So 9.4 gets a review, 9.3, 9.2, 9.1. All right. Any other questions? Yeah, if you want. Like, you don't have to do it. It is extra practice. So if you don't want to do 9.4, you don't have to. It is like extra practice, so you don't have to. All right. Any other questions? If you do 9.4, I'll give you. Well, no, because I already gave you the test correction. No, pretty much 9.4. If you do it, extra practice. If you don't, well, you don't have to. I'm not gonna hurt you. All right. Any other questions? All right, guys. So that's it for today. So have a good weekend, and I'll see everybody on Monday. So stop share, close down.